In the early 1970s, the United States was flying blind. The intelligence community was desperate to know if the Soviets planned a preemptive nuclear strike, but satellite imagery couldn't tell them what was being discussed inside the Kremlin's inner circles. A critical vulnerability was spotted in the Sea of Okhotsk. An undersea cable linked the Soviet Pacific Fleet base at Petropavlovsk on the Kamchatka Peninsula directly to their mainland headquarters in Vladivostok. The problem was that the Sea of Okhotsk was forbidden territory. The Soviets claimed these waters as their own, enforcing the perimeter with warships and seafloor sensors. Entering the region was considered a suicidal risk for any foreign vessel. Navy Captain James Bradley looked for a way in by looking backward. He remembered childhood signs along the Mississippi River that read, "Cable crossing, do not anchor." He hypothesized that Soviet engineers would have placed similar warnings along the shoreline to protect the cable from fishing trawlers, effectively marking the exact path of the line. Bradley knew the project would never survive the formal bureaucracy of the National Security Council. Instead, he pitched the mission directly to Henry Kissinger and Alexander Haig, securing the high-level political cover needed to move forward. This was an all-or-nothing gamble. Success meant direct access to the Soviet nuclear playbook, but being caught inside Soviet territorial waters could have triggered an immediate military escalation. The secret mission required nuclear-powered submarines to be retrofitted with specialized hardware. On the stern, the Navy mounted a chamber disguised as a deep-sea rescue simulator, which served as a lockout and decompression chamber for elite divers. Reaching the cable meant operating 400 feet down in near-freezing water. To survive, divers used saturation techniques, breathing a specialized helium-oxygen mixture, and wearing suits pumped with warm water to prevent hypothermia. The physical risks were extreme. During one deployment, a violent storm caused the USS Seawolf to become stuck in the sandy bottom. Trapped in enemy waters, the captain prepared to detonate scuttling charges to destroy the ship and its crew, before they finally managed an emergency blow to free the hull. Even if the divers reached the cable, they couldn't simply cut into it. Any physical splice would alter the electrical current, immediately triggering automated alarms at the Soviet base. The solution was inductive coupling. This animated diagram shows how the U.S. wrapped a sensitive magnetic sensor around the outside of the cable. It recorded the electromagnetic field generated by the signals passing through the internal wires, allowing the Navy to eavesdrop without ever piercing the casing. However, the raw data was a chaotic mess of overlapping voices. The Soviet cable used frequency division multiplexing to bundle multiple phone lines together, forcing technicians to build custom demultiplexing hardware to separate the signal back into coherent conversations. This 20-foot, 6-ton recording pod was nicknamed the Beast. It was the pinnacle of Cold War maritime engineering, a completely undetectable machine capable of surviving the harshest environment on Earth. The Navy kept the mission's real objective hidden even from the submarine's own crew. Officially, they were told they were searching for debris from a Soviet SSN-12 sandbox missile to study its guidance systems. This cover story became its own intelligence victory. Divers recovered over 2 million pieces of missile debris, which allowed U.S. engineers to reverse engineer the SSN-12's radar. They discovered the missile lacked a suspected infrared backup system, allowing the Navy to develop effective jamming countermeasures. But the real windfall came from the cable tap. Convinced their line was unreachable, Soviet officers were transmitting the vast majority of their military communications in the clear, entirely unencrypted. These intercepts gave the White House a window into Soviet intent that didn't exist anywhere else. When Soviet warning systems registered false alarms of incoming Western missiles, the recordings proved the Kremlin was taking a purely defensive posture rather than preparing for a strike. By verifying that the Kremlin was acting defensively during periods of high tension, U.S. leaders could replace worst-case assumptions with actual data. This unvarnished insight helped stabilize the negotiating table, eventually allowing both sides to sign the SALT II nuclear arms reduction treaty. Operation Ivy Bells ran successfully for a decade. It survived the pressures of the deep sea and the scrutiny of Soviet patrols, but it was eventually destroyed by a breakdown in human security back in Maryland. Ronald Pelton was a former NSA analyst facing personal bankruptcy and over $60,000 in debt. In 1980, He walked into the Soviet embassy in Washington, D.C., and sold the exact coordinates of the Okhotsk cable tap to the KGB. The math of the exchange was lopsided. Pelton traded a multi-billion-dollar project, representing decades of work and risk, for just $35,000. In 1981, U.S. satellites spotted Soviet salvage ships anchored directly over the tap site. By the time the Navy arrived to check the line, the pod was gone. The beast was dismantled by the Soviets and eventually placed on display at the KGB Museum in Moscow. Even after the physical device was lost, the U.S. government tried to keep the secret. Intelligence chiefs threatened to prosecute the Washington Post and NBC News under the Espionage Act for reporting on the operation, even though the Soviets had already been in possession of the hardware for years. Despite the compromise, the engineering lessons from the Sea of Okhotsk became the foundation for a new generation of surveillance. Today, highly modified submarines like the USS Jimmy Carter continue this work, utilizing hull extensions and remote vehicles to tap modern fiber optic lines. Operation Ivy Bells proved that the U.S. could build a machine to conquer the harshest environments on Earth, but it also proved that no amount of engineering can account for a single person who simply decides to walk into an embassy.